Chapter 41 of Arabella Stuart by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. It is a strange and terrible ordination that the vices and passions, the follies and prejudices, the wickedness and the iniquity of man, which run in threads through the whole web of society, spoiling a fair and otherwise beautiful fabric, should chequer the fate of the most virtuous and good with the dark lines of sorrow and misfortune, and that in this strangely constituted world the best feelings of the best hearts, operated upon by the baseness of others, should be very frequently the causes of disaster and distress to those who, if this earth were the soul's abiding place, might claim the brightest lot that falls to the portion of humanity. After leaving the mouth of the river and rounding the North Foreland, the Lady Arabella, somewhat recovered from the first effects of disappointment, came upon deck and stood for a few minutes gazing over the world of waters. The wind, which had not been very favourable for their course down the river, was now all that could be desired. But Arabella, anxious for Seymour's safety, first expressed a wish, and then entreated eagerly, that the captain would lay to for a short time, to afford a chance of the arrival of her husband. The master, now free from the river, was willing to accede to her wishes, and even her attendants, who had recovered from their apprehensions, did not offer any opposition. Towards evening, however, as the expected boat did not appear, it was determined once more to sail on towards Calais, and the execution of this resolution was carried out more eagerly as a ship, then called a pinnace, but which would now be called a sloop, was seen drawing towards them, with the royal flag displayed. Scarcely were they under sail, however, when the pinnace fired a shot across their bows as a signal to bring to. "Aye, I thought so," cried the captain with a loud oath in his native tongue. "This comes of losing time. Go down below, lady, go down below. Your presence only cumbers us here. We shall reach Calais before them yet." "Oh, for heaven's sake, make all sail," replied Arabella. "Be you sure I will do that," replied the man. "She shall stick out every inch of canvas she can carry. But you go down and don't be afraid." And he turned to give orders to his crew. The ship sailed on with all the speed that she could command, but though by no means a slow vessel, the pinnace gained perceptibly upon her, and the only hope was that they might be enabled to reach the French coast before the English vessel actually came up with them. In the meantime, Arabella went down into the cabin, and leaning her head upon her hand, gave herself up to every sort of melancholy anticipation. The women servants who had been sent to accompany her were well nigh strangers to her, and she had no one to whom she could venture to display all the sorrowful feelings of her heart. The only comfort that she felt was the rippling sound of the waves as the ship passed through them, but the hope of escape was faint, even though she felt that they were going with tremendous speed. Her spirit was one that had never through life indulged in sanguine expectations, and with her brightest and most cheerful feelings there had always mingled a shade of melancholy, as if she were forewarned by some internal voice of the sad fate before her. The rapid rate at which the vessel went, the eager cries of the persons in command, the plunging of the ship as she passed wave after wave, for several minutes did, indeed, afford to the unfortunate lady some hope of reaching the coast, which she had seen in the faint distance from the deck. But she was not permitted long to indulge in such anticipations. The report of a cannon soon reached her ear. Another and another followed. Still, however, the ship sailed on, and no sounds from above, but the mere word of command, gave notice that the danger was increased. A pause ensued, and then again the cannon were heard, she thought more distinctly. Still no unusual bustle displayed itself on deck, and one of her women, looking through the small window in the stern, remarked in a low voice that the pinnace seemed more distant. A moment after a single gun was fired, and though there had been some noise above previously, deep silence instantly succeeded. Immediately after, a rattling sound and a heavy fall upon the deck were heard, followed by cries and shouts and exclamations, but the ship continued on her course, and one of the servants coming in informed Arabella that a shot from the pinnace had struck the boat upon the deck, but had done no farther mischief. "It would be better for them to strike," she murmured. "What should I feel if any of them were killed on my account? Better linger out my life in prison than be the cause of bloodshed." "The captain says we shall get to Calais yet, lady," replied the man. "God send it," she answered, and as she spoke the guns of the pinnace were again heard. The next instant the little vessel shook as something struck her, and tearing through the woodwork of the cabin, and casting splinters far and wide, came a ball, which passed within a few feet of the lady, and entered a beam beyond her. Arabella did not start or shrink, for she had no fears for herself, but it seemed evident that the pursuers were drawing nearer, and she was terrified for her companions. Rapid steps now came down the ladder, and the captain of the ship ran in and gazed around. "Go forward, lady," he said. "Go forward into that little room. You'll be safer there. Come, everyone lend a hand, and pile up some hammocks round the side." "Do you think you can outsail them?" asked Arabella. "I hope so, lady," he replied. "At all events, I will try." "Strike when you like," said Arabella, "without considering me. I would not have you risk yourself and your men on my account." "Thank you, lady, thank you," answered the seaman. "We will risk ourselves none the less for what you say, and strike I will not till I am compelled. They have no right to fire at a ship of a friendly country, and our king will have vengeance for such conduct." Thus saying, he left her, and though the guns of the pinnace were fired from time to time, no other event occurred for near a quarter of an hour, when a tremendous crash was heard. The little vessel heeled suddenly, and a rattling sound of falling timber and cordage showed that some of the masts or yards had been carried away. 3 or 4 minutes elapsed, while all eyes in the cabin were fixed anxiously upon the door, and the rate of the ship visibly diminished. At length the captain of the vessel entered, with a sad and gloomy countenance. "It is no use, lady, to try it any longer," he said. "They have carried away our topmast, and we have no chance now. I have done the best for you that I could, but it is vain. Have I your consent to heave to?" "At once," answered Arabella. "Do not let them fire at you again. Make them some signal, my good friend. Now for my prison again," she murmured, as the captain left her. "I have never yet known hope but to be disappointed." And bending down her head, she pressed her handkerchief upon her eyes, while a low, struggling sob or two told that she was weeping, but strove to restrain her tears. In a few minutes she had overcome her emotion, and wiping her eyes, sat calmly till the sound of many voices speaking on the deck and at the side of the vessel showed her that a boat from the pinnace was alongside. After a short pause, steps were again heard coming down, and an English gentleman appeared, completely armed, as was the custom of that age. "The Lady Arabella Stuart," he said, advancing into the cabin and gazing around. "My name is Arabella Seymour, sir," answered the lady, "but I suppose you mean myself." "I do, madam," he replied, "and I regret to say that my orders are to land you and convey you to London as a prisoner. But before I do so, I must beg you to answer me truly whether Mr. Seymour be on board." Arabella started and looked up with an expression of joy. "He has escaped, then," she cried. "He has escaped. Thank God! Thank God! Pardon me, Lord, for murmuring at thy will. He has escaped, and I am happy." "Then I am to conclude, madam," said the officer, "that he is not on board this ship?" "Most assuredly he is not," replied Arabella. "Of that I pledge you my word. I trust that by this time he is safe in France." "No one can tell, madam," was the answer. "He had escaped from the Tower, but to escape from the country is another affair." The only bitter thing that Arabella probably ever said in her life now rose to her lips. "I know it is," she replied. "It seems as if England had become one great prison." And the chill which the officer's words cast upon the hopes that she had entertained of her husband's escape depressed her even more than her own recapture. The ship was immediately taken into port, but all things seemed now indifferent to her. Her mind, agitated by the past, uncertain at the present, apprehensive of the future, became bewildered and confused. She suffered those who were around her to do with her what they would, and during that evening and the following day she appeared to be in a dream, painful and terrible, but indistinct and misty. Nor was it till she found herself passing the gloomy portals of the tower that she awakened to all the stern reality of her fate. Then she burst into tears again, and a cold shudder passed over her frame, as she gazed around upon the grey walls which had witnessed the sorrows and the death of so many of her race. The next morning, early, she was hurried before the council, and subjected to all the anguish of public examination and reproof, which not even her gentleness could mitigate. But as she left the council chamber to return to her sad captivity in the tower, some friendly heart afforded her the greatest alleviation that her grief could receive. In passing through the mixed crowd that filled the corridor, one of the persons present, she could not distinguish whom, whispered in haste, "Mr. Seymour has arrived safe in France." Arabella started and turned round, but hurried on by those who guarded her, she was unable to see any familiar face among the crowd, and uttering the words, "Thank God," she proceeded on her way. On that one thought she pondered during the rest of the day, speaking little to anyone and taking little nourishment, but often repeating to herself, "He is safe, thank God, he is safe." Towards nightfall she was visited by the lieutenant of the tower, who came to inform her that the 2 servants who had been captured with her were to be removed, 3 others, a gentlewoman, a chambermaid, and a man, having been sent to attend upon her by the king. Arabella smiled sadly. "He need not envy me, Lieutenant," she said, "the poor comfort of seeing faces that I know. I shall have few consolations within these walls, but one, indeed, and that he cannot take from me." "And what is that, lady, may I ask?" said the lieutenant. "My trust in God, sir," replied Arabella. "There are justice and mercy above, if not below. But pray let me see these people whom the king has sent. I must welcome my fellow prisoners." "The man, madam," answered the lieutenant, "tells me that he was in your service at Highgate, but as it has been proved that he had no hand in your escape, the king has restored him to you." "Oh, poor Cobham!" exclaimed Arabella. "I shall be glad to see him, though it is selfish too, for he will have a dull life here." "I trust, lady," replied the lieutenant, "that neither he nor you will be long within these walls. The king will, I hope, be satisfied with submission, and set you at liberty ere long." "I must not doubt it, lieutenant," said Arabella, "for that were to accuse him of injustice. I will try to make myself as cheerful under the infliction as may be. I have heard that you are kind to your prisoners, lieutenant, and have to thank you for your treatment of one whom I love better than myself." "I owe a large debt of gratitude to that gentleman's house," answered the officer, "and would gladly repay it, madam, by any courtesy to you, but I shall not have the opportunity, I fear. Tomorrow I am to be removed from my office, to make way for another, but he is a gentleman of good repute, and will, I trust, deal kindly with all under his care. I will now send these people to you, lady, and take my leave, wishing you happier with all my heart." Thus saying, he quitted the room, and in a few minutes the door again opened. Arabella raised her eyes, with as well contented a smile as she could assume, to welcome her old servant Cobham, but by the faint light that streamed through the high window she saw another well-known form, and starting up with a look of joy, she cast herself upon Ida Mara's neck, and then, overwhelmed with various emotions, burst into tears. "Oh, Ida, Ida," she cried, "this is relief indeed." "Hush, dear lady," whispered Ida Mara. "Do not seem too glad to see me. Speak to Cobham and the girl. I will explain all when they are gone." Arabella raised her head, and then saw that 2 of the king's officers had followed the rest of the party. "Ah, Cobham," she said, turning to her old servant, "I am right glad to see you all once more," and she held out her hand to him. The man took and kissed it respectfully, saying aloud, "I would gladly see you anywhere but here, madam, and if you had told me what you were going to do, I would have taken care you should not be here at all." "No rebellious words, sirrah," said one of the officers. "I will report them to the king." "You may report what you like," replied the man bluntly. but Arabella interposed, exclaiming, "Hush, hush, I beseech you, sir, refrain. If you have any of the feelings of a gentleman, you will not think of repeating, where it may do harm, the expression of a faithful servant's attachment to his unhappy mistress. Jane, I am glad to see you." The girl replied with a discontented look, merely saying that she hoped her mistress was well, and then retired with Cobham and the king's officers to the rooms appropriated to the servants of the Lady Arabella, which were contiguous to her own. "Alas, dear lady," said Ida Mara as soon as they were gone, "alas, to find you here! How eagerly did I watch and inquire for any tidings respecting you, and then when I heard that you were taken, I trembled lest they should debar me from seeing you." "But how came they to send you?" asked Arabella. "It is indeed an act of favour which I did not expect." "Why, lady, the king has deceived himself entirely respecting me," replied the fair Italian. "It is his own doing, for I said not one word to mislead him, though I took good care not to contradict him." "You were wise," said Arabella. "He is not one to bear opposition. But how came it about, my Ida?" Ida then related to the lady all that the reader already knows concerning the events which happened to her after quitting Mr. Conyers' house at Highgate. "What was their object," he said, "in taking me away, I have no precise means of knowing, but I saw that dreadful man's face for a moment, and having once vowed revenge against me, I am certain that he will not fail to seek it whenever the opportunity occurs. I believed he was dead till within the last week, for I had not seen him before for several years, but I do not think I can deceive myself now, and though the hair and beard are black instead of grey, the features are the same. But I will not dwell upon that, dear lady. The king cheated himself, as I have told you. He thought I had been carried away by order of your friends, because you could not place confidence in me, and to-day he sent for me, to ask if I would return to attend upon you while you were prisoner in the Tower. I took care not to seem too ready, saying that I did not like imprisonment, nor the Tower for a residence, but that if it were his Majesty's wish, I was ready to obey him implicitly. Thereupon he praised my submission, and assured me that I should have as much liberty as possible while here. He knew not how gladly my heart beat to have permission to come. If he had, I think he would have forbidden it." "And can you really find joy, Ida," asked the lady, "in sharing a prison with me? Who can tell, my poor girl, how long it may last? Who can tell that I may not here end my days?" "Oh, heaven forbid!" cried Ida Mara. "We will soften these stones first with our tears." "Alas," replied Arabella, "I fear that we shall not ever be able to soften the heart of the king by any tears that we may shed. But at all events, your being with me will be an alleviation of my sorrow." "Perhaps you may be able to escape, lady," rejoined Ida Mara. "No, Ida, no," answered Arabella. "I will not try. The net is around me, and it is of no use to flap my wings. On the contrary, I will make a voluntary promise not to escape, if they will give me the full range of my cage, and then, like many another poor bird, I will sit and sting my life away between the bars. I only grieve to think that, for my sake, you should be doomed to the same hard fate." Ida Mara kissed the lady's hand, and gazed in her face with a look of deep sadness, but she only replied, "You forget, madam, that imprisonment to me is not what it is to you. I have nothing in the world without to sigh for. Oh, that they would but keep me and let you go!" Arabella answered her by tears. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Arabella Stuart by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. Never did human being in a world of woe strive with more patient perseverance for contentment with his lot than did poor Arabella Seymour. She called to her aid all the resources of a humble and a faithful spirit. She trusted in God. She resigned herself to his will. She tried to bear the chastening hand with cheerfulness, but it was in vain she did so. Hours, days, weeks passed. The heavy hours, days, weeks of imprisonment, without one hope coming to lighten the burden or assuage the pangs. At first she consoled herself with the knowledge that Seymour was safe beyond the power of the vain tyrant who kept her within those walls. But she soon found that even that consolation, when she indulged in it, produced an evil effect upon her mind. The thought that he was secure and free brought with it the eager yearnings of a warm and affectionate heart to be with him, to rest upon the bosom of him she loved, to hear the music of his voice, to see his eyes beaming upon her with tenderness and devotion. She dared not trust herself with such meditations, for they were dangerous to her tranquillity, and were sure to end in long and bitter weeping. Then she strove to extract hope from some fruitless effort to soften the cold and obdurate heart of the king, as the alchemists of the day attempted to draw gold from lead or iron. But yet, even in the act, she knew it to be idle. She would gaze upon the letter she had written, beseeching this person or that who was supposed to have influence over James to intercede for her, and with a sad smile shake her head and sigh, exclaiming, "Vain, vain, it is all in vain." Then she would wander round the walls of the tower, gaze on the busy multitude swarming freely without, picture to herself the thoughts, feelings, and occupations, trace them in her imagination through their daily labour, and follow them back again to the home of domestic love, and the tears would rise in her eyes as she thought that no such home was ever to be hers. Or at other times she would turn towards the river with its shipping, and mark the light boats gliding over the waters, and long, oh, with what a thirsty longing, to pursue the course of that stream once more, and over the wide sea, to find the free happiness denied her there. And when she looked around on bars and gates and guards, her heart would feel chilled and crushed, and again her tears would rise and drop upon the stones of the wall. Often, when such was the case, some words which had been used by Arabella came back to her mind, and she would ponder on them, and turn them in her imagination 1,000 ways. For sadness ever will sport with fancy, and misery often dances in her chains. One day, as she was sitting in her chamber with the fair Italian beside her, singing to her, she wrote from time to time a word or two on some paper which lay upon the table. And when the girl's song was done, she said, "Give me your instrument, Ida. I will sing you a song now." And placing the paper upright before her, she proceeded to pour forth, to a simple air of the time, the lines she had just written. Song. Ye gloomy walls that circling round oppress this form of clay, when shall my spirit spurn the bound harsh men around it lay? Oh, were there power in tears shed through unnumbered years to soften the hard stone, long ere this weary day, melting the snow away, ye to the dust had gone? Lo, wreathing round your hoary towers, those who lie cold beneath, entwine a coronal of flowers, and honour you in death. Though there were power in tears dropped through unnumbered years to soften the hard stone, the torrents that the dead within these walls have shed had of those towers left none. But all in vain, my heart would fly wide over the land and wave, to scenes of life and liberty from this its prison grave. No, there's no power in tears shed through unnumbered years to soften the hard stone, else would I weep all day and cease only to pray, till ye to dust were gone. But colder than these iron walls, hardest of earthly things, is that which dwells in courtly halls within the breast of kings. Though there were power in tears shed through unnumbered years to soften the hard stone, there fruitless they will prove. Grief has no power to move the heart of man alone. "Now run away, Ida, and fetch me a book," said Arabella. "I must not let such thoughts stir within me any more. They render me discontented, dear girl, and they say a contented heart makes a garden of a wilderness." "Ay, dear lady," answered Idamara with a sigh, "but it is hard work first plucking up the thorns. You have no books but those you have read often. Which shall I bring you?" "Run to Sir Gervase Elway's," said Arabella, "and ask him to lend me something new. He is a learned man, and very complaisant, and I know amuses the tediousness of his charge with much reading. A blessing on those who write for us. How many a heavy heart is lightened by reading the tales of other men's endurance! How many a sick bed is soothed by the light hand of gentle poetry! Good faith, Ida, as it must be for one or the other, I would rather weep for the gone-by sorrows of other people than for my own, too truly present. Ida Mara left her mistress to obey, but in a moment after she came back pale and trembling. "What is the matter, Ida? What is the matter?" cried the lady, starting up. "Ah, madam," answered the girl, "I have just seen that terrible man, Weston, tripping across to the bell tower where poor Sir Thomas Overbury is confined, and I shall now live in constant dread." "Did he see you?" asked Arabella. "I think not. I hope not," replied Ida Mara. "I was under the arch below, and he was going the other way, dressed in black velvet, with soft steps like a cat creeping up to a bird." Arabella mused. "Call Jane hither," she said, and when the girl appeared, she added, "Go to the warder opposite there, and ask him the name of the gentleman dressed in black velvet, who just now crossed to the bell tower." The girl retired without any answer, for she was of a somewhat sullen disposition, and discontented at being kept so long in the tower. She returned in a few minutes, saying, "His name is Dr. Foreman, my lady, and he has gone, by the king's order, to visit Sir Thomas Overbury, who is sick." Ida cast down her eyes thoughtfully on the ground, and Arabella, after giving the maid a sign that she might retire, murmured, "Dr. Foreman! Why, that is the man of whom there was so much talk at the court, a sort of wizard, a conjurer, and a cheat, suspected too of dealing in poisons. I heard the Queen say His Majesty would have him hanged. Can he be sent to Sir Thomas Overbury by the king?" "Oh, lady," cried Ida Mara, "it is the same man, whatever name he may now call himself by. That is Weston. And I will tell you," she added, kneeling on the cushion at the lady's feet, "I will tell you now what it was he wished me to do that made me fly from him in such terror, which I have never told you before. He wished me to go to a young nobleman of the court, who had been pleased with my music, to live with him for a time in sin." And then she paused and sunk her voice to a whisper, adding, "and then to put poison in his drink." Arabella shuddered. "Good heaven!" she cried, "is it possible that such iniquity should live and prosper? But why did you not accuse him and bring him to punishment, Ida?" "Because I had no proof," replied the girl. "At first I fled from him in terror and consternation, knowing that if I did not do as he required, after he had put his secret in my power, he would poison me. And then, when good Sir Harry West delivered me from him, I reflected, and saw that to bring such a charge might but call down destruction on my own head. I was but a poor Italian girl, an alien, a stranger, with no one to speak for me, nothing to corroborate what I said. He had taken care to give me no proof against him. There was but my word against his, and I knew he was supported by many great men, who were more or less in his power, from secrets that they dared not see divulged. What could I do, lady?" You did right, dear Ida," answered Arabella, "but I fear much that, even now, he goes to Sir Thomas Overbury for no good. I will not believe that the king has sent him, or if so, the king is but a tool in the hands of others. This poor knight has many enemies, I fear. Are there no means of warning him against so dangerous a physician?" "Perhaps there may be," answered Ida Mara, "for though there is a guard at each end of the walk on the top of the wall, to prevent his passing farther on either side than for mere air and exercise, yet they have never stopped me as I have passed that way, and one day I saw his door open." "Did you ever meet him?" asked Arabella. "No, never," replied Ida Mara, "but I hear he is ill now and confined to his bed." "Alas!" said Arabella, "who can tell how that illness has been brought about? There were suspicions abroad from the very first. Men discovered that Rochester, instead of being his friend, was his enemy, and there is not such a rancorous hatred on this earth, Ida, as that which dwells in the breast of the ungrateful. This poor man's imprisonment is a living reproach to the king's favourite, and I have many, many doubts." "I shall not dare to turn my steps that way again," said Ida Mara, "lest I should meet that dreadful man. The very sight of him seems to curdle my whole blood, and makes my heart labour as if it would not beat." Arabella remained in thought for a few minutes, and then said, "I will go myself, Ida. He must be warned if possible." "Nay, lady, nay," answered Ida Mara. "I mean not to say that. I will go. We shall soon see him pass back, and then it will be safe." As she spoke, she approached the window and looked out, keeping herself, however, behind the stonework of the wall. Arabella followed her, standing somewhat more forward and gazing down into the open space below. They remained thus, however, for nearly a quarter of an hour, without seeing anyone but an occasional labourer and a party of the guard proceeding towards the outer gates. At length Arabella cried, "Here is someone now, Ida," and the girl, leaning her head a little forward, exclaimed, "That is he, that is he," drawing back instantly from the window with a shudder. Arabella watched him as he crossed towards the gate. "'Tis strange," she said, "I can discover in his appearance none of those deadly signs you speak of. To me he would seem but that pitiful thing, a vain old coxcomb, affecting the air and step of youth, dressed in the butterfly finery of early thoughtlessness, and banishing the comely gravity of years. He trips along like some court dancing master, fancying himself a treasury of graces, which he bestows as a bounty on less gifted men. But he has gone, Ida. Now we will set out together. Nay, I will go with you, for if you are afraid of his company, I am afraid of my solitude. Sometimes, when I am alone, I think I shall go mad." In execution of their design, the lady and her attendants went out and walked slowly along the wall, towards the tower in which the unhappy Overbury was confined. But the orders of the guard were by this time changed, and the man at the angle nearest to the knight's prison dropped his partisan, saying, "You cannot pass here, ladies, unless you give the countersign." "That we are not able to do," answered Arabella, pausing. "We are not soldiers, my good sir, to take the fortress by surprise, and I think they never furnish us poor women with signs or countersigns." "You cannot pass here, madam, without," replied the man bluffly. "There are new orders given for the custody of the close prisoners, so you must take your walk another way." Arabella turned sadly back towards her room, but while she did so, we must pursue, for a short time, the course of the dark and infamous villain who had just left the chamber of Sir Thomas Overbury. Although his step was as light as air, and debonair as ever, Dr. Foreman did not feel altogether well satisfied and at ease. "The man suspects something," he said, speaking evidently of Overbury, "and I doubt this new lieutenant does his duty well." What the duty was which he spoke of would not be difficult to say, for the most corrupt hearts apply to their own purposes, however dark and horrible they may be, the highest and the holiest terms; and the reluctant apprehension which, it would seem, Sir Gervase always felt in yielding himself to the criminal designs of his patrons, was construed by their less scrupulous accomplice into a lack of due devotion to their cause. "That girl, too," continued the charlatan to himself, pursuing his way, "she must be provided for. She would make a cruel witness against one, if anything were to come out. Weston's the man, however. My boy Dick has no scruples. He can settle both affairs at once, and he must have full power, and not be always hampered by this knave of a lieutenant. I must see my Lord of Rochester, and get his authority, otherwise we shall make no progress. To-morrow, I hear, is to be his wedding day with our fair countess, so he will be in good humour." Such reveries brought him to the waterside, and calling one of the wherries, which were perhaps more plentiful upon the Thames in those days than in our own, he made the boatman conduct him at once to Whitehall. On his visit to Rochester, however, we will not pause, reluctant to dwell upon scenes of such depravity one moment more than is absolutely necessary to the history that we tell. It is well known that strict orders were given to the lieutenant of the Tower to admit without restriction the persons selected for the execution of the designs against the unhappy prisoner. Armed with these, Foreman returned to hold a conference, in which he expected to encounter no obstacles, but on that point he was somewhat disappointed. The door of his house was opened for him by the little page, whom we have seen on a former occasion carrying his sword, and in his anteroom above he found the man, Weston, who had been engaged in carrying off Ida Mara from Highgate. He was dressed as a servant, though in somewhat gay attire, but his face was sullen and downcast, and when his worthy master told him to follow him into an inner chamber, he obeyed slowly and without reply. "Now, Weston," cried Dr. Foreman, seating himself, "I have got a great and important affair for you." "I won't undertake it," replied the man. "Won't undertake it?" repeated Foreman, with every mark of surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "that I will not undertake any great affair unless I am to be better rewarded than I was for the last." "But you were not successful," said the doctor. "All people are paid according to their success." "I won't be paid so," rejoined Weston. "I run the same risk whether I am successful or not, and so I have a right to the same recompense, and I will have it beforehand too. I will trust to no man." "There you are right," replied Weston, "and you shall have it beforehand, nor will it be a trifle, I can tell you, for what you have to do will make a great man of you. To set out with, the gentleman who employs me will give you 100 nobles." "Come, this is speaking reason," cried Weston, rubbing his hand. "Let us hear what is to be done. For 100 nobles I will go a good way." "The affair is very easy," answered Foreman, well pleased to bring him so easily to compliance. "I am about to place you in the service of poor Sir Thomas Overbury, who is a close prisoner in the Tower, you know. No one will be admitted to him but yourself, and, as he is very ill, you must be careful of him. Particularly, you must remark that, as I am his physician, he is to take nothing but what I send him. You must even, perhaps, cook his food for him, for there are sick people, you know, who will eat things that are hurtful to them." I understand," said Weston with a nod of the head. "Is there anything more?" "Nothing," answered Foreman, "unless you like, by way of amusing yourself, to be very civil to a pretty lady you carried off from Highgate, who was there in the Tower, attending upon the Lady Arabella. You may ask her to take a glass of wine with you, and I will give you some glasses with twisted stalks, very beautiful to see, which I brought from Venice." "Anything more?" asked the man, in a tone that Dr. Foreman did not altogether like. "No," he replied. "No, you will have quite enough to do to effect this properly, though my Lord of Rochester will furnish you with sufficient powers to prevent much trouble about it." "Well," replied Weston, "I understand you then completely, but to be sure that I make no mistake, in consequence of delicate phrases, I had better repeat the whole in plain English." "It may be as well," said Dr. Foreman with a nod. "Thus it is then," answered Weston. "I am to go into the service of Sir Thomas Overbury in the Tower, to have him quite in my own hands, and to give him the poison that you give me for him." Dr. Foreman nodded. "Then am to make friends with the girl, and poison her too." Dr. Foreman nodded again, and Weston proceeded, "And for all this I am to have 100 nobles. Come, dear doctor, it's time we should understand each other. Very likely, if I were but a common servant, such pay might be considered handsome, but people tell me you are my papa." "There may be some truth in that," said Foreman, with a grin. "Well then," rejoined Weston, "you would not have your dear son put his neck in jeopardy for 100 nobles." "I have often put mine in jeopardy for a less sum," answered Foreman, "before I made the large fortune that I have made, and which I have left to you at my death, if you behave well, Dick. I wish you to work your way up as I have worked mine, and as you are a shrewd youth, with all the money that you will have from me, you may go much farther than I have gone." "I may go to the gallows, perhaps," replied Weston. "Pooh, nonsense," answered his worthy father. "If you go to the gallows, the Lord Rochester and the Countess of Essex must go first, and the king would sooner go himself." "Ay, that is a different affair," cried Weston. "But have you really left me all you have got? For of course that must be a consideration." "You shall see the will yourself," replied the learned doctor, and, opening a strong box, he took out a parchment from amongst several others, and placed it in the hands of his worshipful son. The younger man ran his eyes over it with a look of vast satisfaction. "That's enough," he said. "That's enough. I'll do anything you like. Give me the powders." "Nay," answered Foreman, taking down a bottle from one of the shelves and pouring a small quantity of the liquor it contained into a phial. "You must give this to Sir Thomas Overbury by a spoonful at a time. Then, as for the girl, here is this powder. If you can ever get her to eat or drink in your presence, you have nothing to do but to hold the contents between your finger and thumb, so, and drop it upon her food, or into her cup. It will dissolve instantly, and in half an hour she will be in heaven. Sudden deaths will happen. Who can help it?" "Nobody, to be sure," answered the young man, laughing. "But I don't see why you should wish her out of the way." "Oh, I have good reasons, said Foreman, nodding his head significantly. "Ah, well, it's no business of mine," cried Weston. "I'll do the business. Give me the drugs." Foreman delivered them into his hands, then added several directions as to his conduct, and furnished him with a letter from Lord Rochester to the Lieutenant of the Tower. To secure all, the 100 nobles were bestowed at once, and Weston departed from the room to make ready for his expedition. But the first thought that crossed his mind was, "No, no, Overbury if you like, but the girl is safe. This powder I'll keep for another occasion, and if you play me false, old gentleman, look to yourself." With this hint of his very filial intentions, he secured the drugs in the heart of a bundle of clothes, and set out upon his errand with as much alacrity as if he was going to a wedding feast. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Arabella Stuart by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. There had been a good deal of bustle and confusion in the Tower during the morning, 3 days after the events which we have related in the last chapter. 2 persons, bearing the appearance of physicians, had crossed from the gate to the Tower, in which Overbury was imprisoned, and visited him in company with the lieutenant, while from the window of the Lady Arabella's chamber might be seen a group consisting of the notorious Dr. Foreman, Weston, and another man, conversing together eagerly, and evidently waiting till the personages who had been admitted to their victim returned. The physician soon passed by the spot where they stood, without taking any other notice of them than by a contemptuous look, which the younger of the two bestowed upon Foreman, and immediately after Sir Gervase Elwes joined their evil counsel, and remained in conversation with them nearly half an hour. After the consultation was concluded, Foreman quitted the Tower, and the rest of the party separated. Silence and solitude then took possession of the walls and courts around, and during the rest of the day it was remarked that an unusual degree of stillness prevailed in that part of the fortress, few, if any, persons being seen moving about, and the only noises heard being those which rose from Tower Hill and the streets adjacent. In the meanwhile, since the day that we last spoke of, Arabella had fallen into a state of deeper despondency than ever. Her efforts for cheerfulness were all vain, and she sat for hours gazing listlessly out of the window, with the tears rising from time to time in her eyes, indicating the sad thoughts that were busy at her heart. It was to no purpose that Idamara strove by every means in her power to engage her mind with other things than her own hard fate. Books had lost their charm for her, music seemed but to increase her grief, and though once or twice she tried to converse, she soon lost herself in reveries again, from which it was difficult to rouse her. "Leave me, Ida, leave me," she said at length, as evening was beginning to fall. "My heart is very heavy, and it is vain to try to lighten it. You have stayed within with me all day, dear girl. Go out and breathe the fresh air now. A walk round the walls would do you good." "I do not like to leave you so sad," replied Idamara. "I wish you would come with me. I'm sure it will better for you than sitting here alone." I will presently," replied Arabella. "Come back in half an hour, dear Ida, and I will go with you. But leave me now." Idamara saw that it was in vain to press her father at that moment, and leaving her, rambled through the vacant courts and round the wide wall of the Tower, meeting with few of its inhabitants. till, on her return, in one of the narrow passages, she suddenly found herself face to face with one of the men who had carried her off from Highgate. He had evidently been drinking largely, and she made an effort to pass him at once, hoping that he might not notice her. He stopped her, however, though not uncivilly, saying, "Ah, pretty lady, is that you? I am glad to see you here, for I once did you some wrong, and I don't intend to do so any more, whatsoever they may say. You forgive me, pretty lady, don't you?" The man, though not drunk, was not quite sober, and Ida Mara was somewhat alarmed. "Oh yes, I forgive you freely," she replied, "but I must go on, for the Lady Arabella expects me." "Nay, stop a bit," said Weston. "We are old acquaintances, you know. I am Sir Thomas Overbury's servant now, but I shan't be long, I think." Ida listened eagerly. "Poor man, he is very ill, I hear," she replied. "Ay, that he is," answered Weston, "but he is a devilish long time about it. He's too cunning to give up life easily, so he makes a hard struggle against death." "Who would not?" said Ida Mara with a shudder, for she put her own interpretation on the man's words. "Pray, what is his complaint?" "Nay, I know not," answered Weston. "A multitude, I believe. He makes nothing but complaints from morning till night. He'll be more at ease when he's gone." "As many others will," answered Ida Mara. "Ay, ay," rejoined Weston with a stupid look. "But you need not be afraid. I'll keep that for myself. I may have need of it." Ida Mara did not comprehend what he meant, but she was interested in the fate of Sir Thomas Overbury, and, knowing that her lady would entertain the same feelings, she said, as the man seemed rather loquacious in his wine, "Poor Sir Thomas is very strictly confined, I believe. The guards will let no one pass even near his door." "Oh, the guards are gone now," replied Weston. "They are not much wanted. Nobody sees him but myself and Franklin, and we have admission at all hours." "Then he is so weak, I suppose," observed Ida Mara, "that he cannot stir from his bed, so that escape is impossible?" "He might as well try to escape from his grave," rejoined the other, "and yet he lingers long." "Well, I must go on now," said Ida. "Good night, sir, good night." "Good night," answered Weston. "I don't suppose I shall see you in the Tower again, pretty lady, for at 9 I bring his supper to him, and that is the last meal he will eat, I fancy." Thus saying, he suffered the fair Italian to pass and walked on his way. Arabella was sitting in the same spot where Ida Mara left her, with the last faint rays of day streaming in from the window upon that face, once so beautiful, but now faded and worn with the anguish of the heart, so that those who had loved her best would hardly have known her. Her eyes were red with weeping, but the tears had been wiped away, and when Ida entered she turned round and tried to smile. "Well," she said, "what hast thou seen, dear friend? Come, sit you down beside me, Ida. I shall not go out to-night, though the moon, peeping up there, seems to ask me to come forth under her melancholy light, which is but too like the complexion of my own thoughts, where the only brightness is the reflection from a star that has set." "I have met with something worth telling, lady," replied Ida Mara. "It is not often one does so within these walls." And taking a seat beside Arabella, according to her orders, she began, and in a low voice recounted all that had occurred. Her tone was soft and quiet, but there was an earnest sadness in her manner, which seemed to imply that she attached more importance to the conversation she recapitulated than the mere words would justify. When she had told all, she dropped her voice still further, and added, "He is dying, lady, that is clear, and I fear much by poison." "Alas, alas!" said Arabella, "this is a terrible fate, and if he had faults, as doubtless he had, they have been punished direfully. Oh, Ida, Ida, what a horrible thing! To die in a gloomy prison, debarred the support of kindred faces round one, or the comfort of the voices that we love, or the touch of the hand of affection, or the consolation of a good man's prayer, with assassins to tend our bed of death, and the eyes that hate us gazing on our agony. Oh, Ida, it is too terrible. I will go to him. A woman, a Christian, I cannot stay here and leave him to expire without anyone to pity or anyone to help. I must go to him, Ida. You say that the guards are gone. Perhaps the doors may be locked, but still I can speak to him through the window. I can tell him that I grieve for him. I can bid him to look to God, to his Saviour, to atonement, to redemption, to a world where the sorrows of this earth shall find compensation at last." Her words were somewhat wild and her manner unusually vehement, but though Ida feared that Arabella might witness a scene which would only tend to agitate and depress her still farther, she did not like to remonstrate. "I am ready, lady," she replied. "What shall I bring you?" "Nothing but a veil," answered Arabella. "My temples burn, the cool air will refresh me. Put on the black mantle, Ida, and draw the hood over your head, then no one will see us as we glide along the walls. Or, if they do, they will take us for the spectres of some who have been here murdered. How many? Oh God, how many?" Ida obeyed her directions, and then, issuing forth, but without passing through the room in which the servants sat, they walked with slow and silent steps towards the tower, in which Sir Thomas Overbury was lingering out the last few hours of his miserable captivity. All was silent and still. The sun was now fully set. The gibbous moon, a few days short of her full, just shone over the parapet. The night was cool but clear, without a breath of air stirring in the heaven. The murmur of the great city rose up around, like the sound of distant waters rolling over a pebbly bed, and a red star, shining near the earth's bright satellite, looked rather like an angry rival of the Queen of Night than her soft attendant train-bearer. Stealing quietly on, Arabella and her companions reached the tower where the poor captive lay, entered the open gateway which led to the stairs, and tried the door on the right hand, which they knew to be that of the sick man's chamber. It was locked, however. "We must go to the window," said Arabella in a low voice, and issuing forth again, she walked round to a small loophole at the height of about 4 feet from the ground, the casement of which she found open. "Keep where you can see if anyone comes, Ida," said Arabella, and approaching close to the window, she looked in. A lamp was standing on the table, shedding its faint and sickly light around the narrow chamber in the tower, and a pale, emaciated form lay stretched upon a pallet close beneath the lady's eyes, as she looked through the loophole. Beside him, on a stool, was a cup containing some liquid, and a book. But the fluid had not been tasted, and he seemed but little in a condition to read. Every feature of the sick man's face betokened pain. His eyes were turned towards the rafters overhead, his knees drawn up, his right arm under his head, and the thin fingers of his hand grasping the pillows as if in bitter agony. A moan burst from his lips as Arabella watched him, and, without farther pause, she said in a low but distinct voice, Sir Thomas Overbury." The unhappy man started up and looked round the room with faint and weary eyes, but could see no one. "Who is that?" he asked, turning his face at length towards the window. "Someone called me." "Whose face is that? I cannot see the features." "It is I," answered the lady. "It is I. A friend, Sir Thomas." "A friend?" said Overbury, with a woeful shake of his head. "God help us, is there such a thing?" "It is Arabella Seymour," replied the lady, "once Arabella Stuart, and she comes to comfort you as far as a weak fellow captive can." "Ah, lady," exclaimed Overbury, "does one whose misery I myself have wrought come now to comfort me, and generously call herself my friend?" "Yes, Sir Thomas," answered Arabella, "and I beseech you remember that not only a poor fallible creature like yourself, but the God whom we have offended, the Saviour whom we crucified, comes likewise to the sick-bed of every sinner, calls himself his friend, and offers comfort, hope, and consolation, if he will but accept it." "Lady, I have been trying to think of such things," replied the dying man. "I have been trying to turn my thoughts to my Saviour, but I am tormented by fiends in human shape that give me no rest. Lady, I am dying of poison. For weeks I have taken nothing that is not drugged. My food, my drink, the very salt which, once given by the wild Arab, secures his bitterest enemy from his vengeance, is mingled with deadly minerals." "Alas, alas!" cried Arabella, with tears rising in her eyes. "How can I help you?" "No way," he replied. "God has withdrawn his countenance from me, perhaps to restore it when purified hereafter. But in this world there is no more hope. Would it were over, for I am in torture. Not a limb, not a muscle is sound, and yet I will not make myself their instrument. I will not take more of anything they give me than is absolutely needful for the bare support of life." "I can bring you food," exclaimed Arabella eagerly. "The guards are now away. Through this window I can supply you every night." "Oh, blessings on you!" cried the wretched man. "You are an angel indeed." Just as he spoke, Idamara ran up to Arabella, exclaiming, crouch down, lady. Here are 2 men coming with a light. They will not see us in that corner." Bending down in the angle of the wall and covered by the deep shadow that it cast, Arabella and the fair Italian waited, in the belief that the men would pass. But though their steps were soon heard coming, the sound ceased when they reached the gate of the tower, and the moment after voices were distinguished speaking in the chamber of Sir Thomas Overbury. The first words did not clearly reach the ears of those without, but Arabella crept somewhat nearer to the window, and then she heard the unfortunate man reply, "I will not take anything. I do not want it." "Ay, but you must take some supper, or a little wine at least," said a rough voice. "No, I will not," he answered shortly. "I know your horrible devices. I will take no more from your hands. I would rather die of starvation. Put the supper down there, and when you are gone, I will cut from the heart of the meat which you cannot poison, sufficient to support life. I have an antidote, too, that you know not of, which will make what I do eat sure, but I will take nothing while you are here. The very sight of such fiends destroys me." Come, said another voice. "This is all nonsense, Sir Thomas. Take some wine, or I will pour it down your throat. You will die of hunger, and then men will say that we have poisoned you." "They will speak but too truly," cried Overbury. Get you hence, I will drink nothing." After these words came a low murmuring for several minutes, as if 2 persons were speaking together in an undertone, and unable to refrain any longer, Arabella raised her head and looked in. The 2 men, Weston and Franklin, who had been appointed to attend upon Sir Thomas Overbury in prison, were standing together near the table, apparently in consultation, with their heads close together, and far too eager in the dreadful occupation which they had undertaken, to notice at the dark window the face gazing at them from without. At length the former approached the bedside of the prisoner, while the other went round towards the head of the couch, saying in a civil tone, "I wish you would take something, Sir Thomas." "I will not," cried the unhappy man. "What are you doing there?" he added. "Only smoothing your bolster," replied the villain, but at the same instant he snatched the pillow from beneath the dying man's head and cast it upon his face. The other murderer threw himself upon it, while Weston held it tightly down, and with a loud and piercing scream, Arabella clasped her hands together and darted away along the wall, crying, "Murder! Murder!" Idamara followed her as far as possible, but she was not yet concealed by the buildings when one of the men looked out. He instantly ran back, pale and trembling, and whispered to his companion, who was still holding the pillow tightly down over the face of their victim, "He is gone. You may take it off. I have seen his spirit." Weston gazed at him with wild and haggard eyes for a moment, and then removed the pillow. A slight convulsion passed across Overbury's countenance, and then all was still. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Arabella Stuart by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. Idamara sat by the bedside of Arabella during the whole of that night, and a sad and terrible night it was. Her mind, agitated and worn with her own cares, had given way to the terrible sight which she had witnessed. The dark deed haunted her imagination. The forms of the murderers still appeared before her eyes. She heard their voices ringing in her ears. The last look of their wretched victim, before they extinguished the lingering spark of life for ever, remained present to her remembrance, hanging like a terrible picture before her, and her thoughts and words were all confused and wild. Idamara hoped and trusted that time would remove such horrible images, and restore the sweet being she so dearly loved to tranquillity and reason. But day went by after day, and although some slight amendment was perceptible, Arabella's mind never recovered its tone. At times, indeed, she would be quite collected and calm, would speak and reason and lament and weep over her fate, as she had been accustomed to do before. But often, even in the midst of her most quiet conversation, when no subject of a painful or exciting nature engaged her thoughts, she would suddenly seem to lose herself. Her words would become rambling and unconnected, and she would pause and put her hand to her head, as if she felt that all was not right there, ending with a long, deep fit of silence, afraid to speak, lest what she uttered should be incoherent. At other times, again, her mind would be quite astray. She would fancy she saw strange faces, and heard dying groans. She would think that she herself was to be murdered, and would cling to Ida in terror, grievous to behold. Then she would talk of former days, of him she loved, of their first hours of affection. She would fancy that he was gone upon some embassy to a foreign court, and would return speedily, and she would sit and sing the songs of peace and joy, till Ida wept at the contrast between such wild but happy dreams of a disordered intellect, and the sad and stern realities of that sweet lady's fate. All these various changes, however, exhausted her strength and wore her frame, and even in the lucid intervals, when her mind was completely itself, the gloomy sense of her wretchedness undermined her health, and wrought a sad change in her appearance. At these times she would often talk of the events of that dark and terrible night when the designs against Overbury's life were consummated, and though at first Ida strove to direct her attention to some less horrible subject, she soon found it was in vain, and, on the contrary, endeavoured to lead Arabella to discuss it quietly and reasonably, in the hope that, by regulating her thoughts upon that point, her mind might be restored to its tone. Some indulgence was now shown to the poor captive, and though she was only permitted to see her fellow prisoner and kinswoman, Lady Shrewsbury, upon 2 occasions, yet other friends from without were frequently admitted to visit her, and 2 of the king's physicians were instructed to watch over her health. The greatest comfort, however, that Arabella received was when some post from France brought her messages from her husband, full of that deep and tender affection which he never ceased to entertain for her to the last hour of his life. She found that he generally hovered about in the neighbourhood of the coast, still hoping, still praying, that he might be permitted to rejoin her and pass the rest of his days in wiping the tears from her eyes, and blotting out sorrow in happiness. Those hopes and prayers were daily disappointed, but still they were a comfort to his mind, and once or twice, when a letter in his own hand was secretly introduced into the tower by some of those who visited the lady, it would produce a great and manifest change. Though it generally made her weep at first, she would become more cheerful and more resigned, and often sitting down would write an eloquent appeal to the king or to his ministers, trying to excite in them some sense of justice and of compassion. Sometimes, when news from Seymour had been delayed for a longer period than usual, she would send Ida Mara forth, for which permission could generally be obtained from the lieutenant, to seek for intelligence at the house of anyone who was likely to receive communications from France. Generally these visits were to the court of England, or to persons in the city of London, but occasionally Ida was sent to different members of the lady's own family, or of Seymour's, in order to obtain some tidings, even though the persons she sought lived at some distance from London. When this was the case, Arabella, who never forgot, even when her intellect wandered most widely, to think of the comfort and safety of others, sent her old and faithful servant Cobham with her fair companion. But still the most frequent channel of communication between Seymour and his unhappy wife was our good old friend Sir Harry West, from whom she was generally sure to receive some news every week, or at least some comforting assurance that nothing but accidents had delayed the arrival of intelligence from across the Channel. While Ida was gone upon any of these errands, Arabella would remain sad and gloomy, and often would take no nourishment for a whole day, if she was absent so long, and the faithful girl always reluctantly left her, even for a few hours, seeing that she invariably became worse during her absence. But when the lady was once possessed with the idea that news had been long delayed, that something must have gone wrong with her husband, that he must be ill or dead, fancies which frequently assailed her, Ida, as the lesser of 2 evils, was fain to go wherever there was any chance of obtaining information. Such had been the case one morning, when for several days they had been without any communications with the court or the city. A greater degree of bustle and activity had been observable in the tower than usual, but occupied with their own sad thoughts, neither Arabella nor Idamara had given any attention to that which was passing around them, although the servant Cobham had mentioned something of fresh prisoners, of a high rank, being added to the number already within the walls. When Idamara, however, returned from the house of the Earl of Shrewsbury, to which she had been sent, she entered the lady's chamber in a state of greater agitation than she generally displayed. She strove, indeed, with anxious care for Arabella, to render her own tone and manner as quiet as possible. While sitting down beside her, she proceeded to tell all she had gathered in her morning's walk. The first news was, that contrary winds had prevented any vessels arriving from France for nearly a week, but that intelligence was expected every day. Arabella looked sadly disappointed, and Ida hastened to turn her attention to another theme. "The whole town is in a commotion, dear lady," she said, "with events which, though terrible and painful, I cannot and will not regret. I told you some days ago that the Lieutenant, Sir Gervase Elwes, had been removed and arrested, but I did not know the cause." "And what might it be?" said Arabella in an indifferent tone. "It matters not to me who is my gaoler, Ida." "No, lady," answered the young Italian, "but dark deeds have at length been brought to light, and justice has been done upon the wicked." "Then there has been a sad clearing of the streets of London, and of the court too," replied Arabella. "Indeed there has," said Idamara, "and some who I cannot help thinking were your worst enemies are now close prisoners within these walls." "God have mercy on them," rejoined the lady, without even inquiring who they were, "for they will find none from man, unless they be very wicked indeed." "I hope they may not," answered Idamara, "for it is but fitting that such crimes should be punished. The murderers of Sir Thomas Overbury, lady—" "Ha! What of them?" exclaimed Arabella eagerly. "They have been brought to justice, madam," answered Idamara. "Weston, the principal assassin, was tried some days ago, and executed the day before yesterday, though he, it seems, was only a tool, though a willing one. That dark and terrible man who calls himself Foreman, but whom I knew long ago by the same name of Weston, was, it would appear, the chief agent of the higher fiends who moved the whole." "And what has become of him?" asked Arabella. "Has he escaped?" "The vengeance of man he has, but not that of God," replied Idamara. "He died suddenly at Lambeth about a fortnight ago, and there is strong suspicion that some of his own poisons administered to him by the hand of his own son, for the purpose of sooner obtaining possession of his wealth, saved him from public trial and execution. But there are multitudes more involved in this terrible affair. A woman, of the name of Turner, has been hanged this morning at Tyburn. A number of people, I understand, aye, ladies of high rank, went to see her die, and Sir Gervase Elwes himself was tried yesterday, and condemned to death for murder." "Heaven help us!" cried Arabella, "that men of station and education, from amongst the once famed gentlemen of England, should dip their hands in such foul and horrible things." "Ay, lady," continued Idamara, "but there are higher heads still, against which the charge is levelled. He who was lately my Lord of Rochester, now Earl of Somerset, with his fair but wicked countess, are both imprisoned here, as those who set the others on to commit the terrible deed. Their trial is expected every day, and the king vows they shall have no mercy, though men think it somewhat strange that Sir Thomas Monson, the chief agent of the countess, was yesterday in the midst of his trial, carried from the bar by the yeomen of the Tower, and the whole proceedings against him stopped." "Indeed," cried Arabella, "indeed that is very strange. But when the innocent are punished, as I have been, for no offence, we need not wonder that the guilty escape. So will it be with Somerset, Ida," she continued. "The king will not dare, I fear, to strike at one who may possess more secrets than either you or I ever dreamed of." "At all events, dear lady," answered Ida, "his favour at the court is gone, and as I cannot but think that to him you owe much of the persecution you have endured, your appeals to the king for justice may have more attention, now that his influence is at an end." "True, true," cried Arabella, starting up with a look of joy. "I never thought of that. Oh, God of heaven, grant it! Quick, bring me paper, dear girl. I will write to the king at once. Perhaps he will listen to me now." And she sat down and composed one of those touching epistles to James, which have more than once brought tears into the eyes of those who read them, even in these far-removed times. For several days the events which we have mentioned gave her hope, but the heartless tyrant whom she addressed paid no attention to her petition. Days, hours, weeks slipped away without the slightest change. The guilty Somerset and his beautiful fiend were brought to trial, judged and condemned, and then the favour of their vicious sovereign stepped in and saved them from the death they merited. But poor Arabella derived no benefit from the fall of two beings who, if there had been justice in the land, would have expiated on the scaffold the manifold crimes too clearly proved against them. A more terrible fate than death indeed awaited them. Sent from the court to an estate in the country to which they were bound to confine themselves, their dark and criminal love was soon turned to the most deadly hatred. The intense impression of each other's guilt rendered their mutual abhorrence, and its consequences almost as horrible as their passion and the events which it produced. Living in the same house, seeing each other daily, they dwelt together as strangers, and when the one crossed the path of the other, looks of enmity and scorn came across those two fair countenances, where once had shone the eager fire of vicious love. Thus passed many a year of painful existence, with the awful prospect of death and retribution before them, till a strange and terrible disease swept the woman from the earth, and her husband fell lingering into the grave. With Arabella the last hope faded away when she found that no change in the court and councils of the king produced any favourable result to her, and with it the powers of life seemed gradually to sink. Slowly but sadly the last hour approached, with all the terrible concomitants of weary sickness and wandering intellect, and the 2 or 3 faithful friends, who now almost daily visited her, saw, with mingled grief and relief, that the period of her sufferings would not be long protracted. One of the most constant of these was good Sir Harry West, in whose conversation she seemed to find more consolation and comfort than in that of anyone else, except Ida Mara. With him she was always tranquil and generally collected. Their conversation was constantly about her husband, and the good old knight, though he did not strive to buoy her up with those earthly hopes which he knew would prove false, dwelt upon those higher and less frail assurances of happiness at some future period, which suited well his years and characters, and harmonized also with Arabella's feelings. On the subject of religion, which was her greatest blessing and comfort now in the hour of her dark adversity, her mind was always as clear and bright as in those days when, in intellect and virtue, she stood in the midst of a court, superior to the allurements of the idle vanity and pitiful ambition that characterized it. But on every other subject reason often failed. To Sir Harry West she would frequently speak of that painful wandering of thought, that want of control over her own mind, which now too often came upon her. "In those moments," she said one day, "when there is, as it were, a cloud upon me, and all my ideas seem misty and indistinct, the weight of my sorrow is the most burdensome. I cannot refrain from wishing for death, and a voice like that of a fiend appears to urge me on to seek the calm and tranquil resting place, where no tyrant's hand can reach, no persecution trouble my repose. I have only, however, to open the page of this holy book, to look into the promises there given, to remember how the only pure and holy one that ever lived and died suffered without a murmur, and the evil spirit flies overmatched, and my mind acquires its faculties again. I hope not for life, Sir Harry. I long for death. I have only one wish that I venture to indulge, which is, that I might see once more him whose love cost me so much misery, though I would not lose that love if I might win a long life of happiness in exchange." Sir Harry West made her no reply, but turned the conversation to another theme, and aided by Ida Mara, who now never left Arabella night or day, he contrived to while away another hour of the poor captive's time, without any return of that sad wandering which she dreaded more herself than even the approach of death. Nevertheless, the old knight, as he turned him home again, pondered deeply over what she had said, and that night visited several of the most influential personages of the court, with whom his own high character gave him considerable influence. 10 days passed afterwards, during which he visited the lady several times, but spoke less of William Seymour than before. Perhaps it was that he saw her strength was now rapidly failing, and feared to touch upon a subject that moved and agitated her much. The last time he came she was stretched upon a couch, which had been brought into the chamber where she usually sat, and holding out her hand to him with a faint smile, she said, "It is coming rapidly, Sir Harry, and this unhappy heart will soon be at peace. I am sure of it, for during the last 2 days my mind has been quite itself again. The memories of past happiness have come around me sweetly and tenderly, like children round a parent's deathbed, and I am quite prepared to go where they will follow me, and nothing ever take them from me again. Nay, I have made you weep, my friend, and poor Ida too. I have cost that dear girl many tears, but when I am gone I am sure you will be a father to her. Is it not so?" "I will indeed," answered Sir Harry West. "I owe her far more than that, were it possible to repay the debt." "There is something more," said Arabella. "When I am dead, Sir Harry, tell my dear husband that I loved him to the last. Cut off a lock of my hair with your own hand and give it to him. It is all that poor Arabella has to send. Tell him that we shall meet hereafter, that I will wait for him, and then none shall separate us. And now, farewell, kind friend. I must not have you stay. I do believe that we shall never meet again, for the impression rests upon my mind that the sun which sinks tonight will not rise again for me." End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Arabella Stuart by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. On the morning of a rough and stormy day, a fishing boat of a large and heavy build, and filled principally with Frenchmen, touched the low beach of the Kentish coast, at the distance of about a mile from Folkestone, near the spot where now stands the pleasant little village of Sandgate. The moment that the boat took ground, a tall and powerful man, habited in dark but well-fashioned garments, sprang at once in the water, and waded to the shore, then paused for a moment while one of the fishermen followed him, carrying a small valise, counted out a number of pieces of gold into the man's hands, took the valise from him, and without another word but "Remember," turned his steps towards Hythe. Striding on at a rapid pace, he soon reached that place, and paused to look round for an inn. When he found one, he asked for no refreshment, but inquired eagerly if he could hire or buy a horse. One was without difficulty procured to purchase, an old saddle and bridle were added, and mounting, without exchanging one word more than was necessary with anyone, the stranger rode on at a quick pace upon the road to London. The people of the inn gazed after him, commenting as usual on his demeanour, but whatever were their remarks, he troubled not his mind, and at the fullest speed the beast could put forth, he urged the horse onwards towards the capital. His eyes, as he rode, were generally bent down upon the ground, and no change in the gloomy expression of his countenance displayed itself, except when the horse slackened his pace, and then he started, as if from a deep reverie, to urge it on as quickly as before. Twice he stopped to give it water, and once to let it feed, but while he did so, he stood beside it, uttering not a syllable to anyone, and the moment the measure of corn was consumed, he sprang upon its back again and resumed his journey. On Rootham Heath the animal's strength began to fail, and at the village beyond, the traveller inquired if he could buy another horse, but none was to be found till he reached Farningham, where, at a little inn which then stood by the roadside, he obtained a wretched beast, for which he paid whatever was demanded, caused the saddle instantly to be placed upon it, and leaving the other behind, with orders to feed it well till the next day, he again rode on, and pursued his way to London, without having tasted food since he touched the English shore, though nearly 12 hours had elapsed, and the sun had long set. Through the dark and gloomy streets of the capital he took his way without pause or inquiry, till he stopped at the gate of a large house just beyond the city wall, where he sprang to the ground and rang the bell. A man with a light opened the doors and gazed upon the visitor's face as on that of a stranger, but suddenly a gleam of recognition lighted up the old servant's face, and exclaiming, "Ah, is that you, sir? He took the rein, threw it over a hook fixed to the wall for that purpose, and lighted the newcomer into the house. It was towards 11 o'clock on the same night that two gentlemen stood at the great western gate of the tower, demanding admission. "That cannot be, Sir Harry," said the warder on duty, "and though I wish to show you all respect, it is against the rule." "I know it," said Sir Harry West, "but here is an order from the constable which supersedes all rule. You will perceive that it is for any hour of the night or day." "Ay, sir, that is a different affair," replied the man. "Follow me, and I will pass you through the wards. 'Tis well I was not asleep. You might have knocked long enough if I had been." Lead on, my good fellow," said the companion of Sir Harry West, a tall man, wrapped in a large dark mantle. The warder turned and looked at him, for there is nothing which irritates a slow and deliberate person so much as impatience in another. And perhaps the man might not have quickened his step in the slightest degree, had there not been that look of stern, anxious grief in the handsome countenance of the stranger, which almost always exercises a certain degree of power, even over the cold and indifferent. Moving on without reply, then, he led the two late visitors through the several doors and gates, till Sir Harry said, "Now can I pass on, warder?" "Not without the word, sir," replied the soldier, and giving it, he suffered the gentleman to proceed alone. They bent their way straight towards the apartments of Arabella Seymour, and mounting the stairs, knocked at the door. No one answered, and the taller of the two, though it seemed that his hand trembled sadly, lifted the latch at once and went in. It was a small anteroom that he entered, which was tenanted by only one person, the maid Jane, who was sitting in a chair so sound asleep by the fire that she had heard no noise. The stranger gave her a look almost fierce, but Sir Harry put his hand upon his arm, saying, "This way, William. We can enter this room, and most likely shall find Ida here." Without uttering a word, the stranger strode on, and opened the door, but to the surprise of Sir Harry West, who had imagined that at that late hour Arabella must have retired to her bedchamber, they found lights and several people there. Stretched upon the same couch where she had been lying when the old knight visited her in the morning, was the pale form of the once beautiful Arabella Stuart. Ida Mara was kneeling near her head, supporting her, while an old man, dressed as a clergyman, was placing a silver cup to her lips, and pronouncing the solemn words with which the sacramental wine is offered us in the communion. At the lady's feet knelt her good servant Cobham, and everyone was so intently occupied with the rite which was taking place that the opening of the door passed unnoticed. Seymour paused till the last prayer had been uttered by the chaplain, and Arabella, placing her hand over her eyes, had murmured a few words, which were not heard distinctly. The young gentleman then advanced slowly, and as silently as possible, but the sound of his footfall caught his poor wife's ear, and turning on the couch, she exclaimed, "Whose step is that? It is he, I am sure. Oh, Seymour!" and she stretched out her arms towards him. Seymour rushed forward and caught her to his heart. "This is a blessing, cried Arabella. "Now I am ready to die. Speak to me, Seymour, speak to your Arabella." But Seymour could not, for he had buried his eyes upon her bosom, and tears drowned all utterance. "Nay," she continued, "nay, Seymour, do not grieve so bitterly. I am happy and contented now I have seen you once more. God has heard my anxious prayer. I have nothing more to look for in life. I am ready to obey his summons." "Oh, live, my Arabella," cried Seymour, raising his head and kissing her eagerly. "Live yet for happiness. The connivance which has been given to my return, the order for my admission here, all make me hope that the king will yet relent." "He knows that I am dying, Seymour," replied Arabella, "otherwise he had not consented. But still, William, I will live for happiness, and happiness with you, in a world where real happiness only is known. We may be parted once more for a brief space of time. To you, indeed, it may seem long, for you will have to struggle with the cares and sorrows of earth. But when you arrive at the end and look back, it will seem but an hour. I know it by experience. But let me look at you," she continued. "I thought I should never see that dear face again. You are changed, my love, and worn, but I know that your heart is unaltered. How much have I to be thankful for that the hands I love best will close my eyes, the lips I love best receive my parting breath, and that soon I shall be gone from a world of misery to wait for you where misery is at an end." It was in vain that she sought to give him consolation. The very resignation she displayed, the gentleness, the tenderness, but added poignancy to his regret. And while the weak and dying girl was calm, collected, and content, the strong man was overwhelmed with sorrow, agony, and repining terrible to witness. For about half an hour the unexpected arrival of her husband seemed to have given Arabella new life. Her voice had become strong and clear, the dimness which had spread over her eyes was removed, even the grey shade which coming dissolution had cast over the face fled for a short time, and during a few minutes a pale pink glow, like the last which tinges the evening sky, arose in her cheek. To Seymour those signs gave no hope, for the terrible change which had taken place in her since last he had held her in his arms had come upon him suddenly, and spoke too plainly of speedy death for him to entertain a doubt. To Ida Mara, however, the alteration which had taken place during the last 2 or 3 years in that sweet lady's appearance had been so gradual that she knew not how great it was, and the signs that she saw of reviving life did give a faint and trembling hope that the fiat of the Almighty had not gone forth irrevocably. It was soon extinguished, however. The effects of joy speedily passed away, and only the more rapidly for the temporary relief. The great enemy of life made progress in his conquest. The voice sank low again, the film came over the eyes, the colour faded from the cheek, the brow and temples grew awfully pale, the greyness of the tomb once more spread over the whole countenance. "She is departing," said the chaplain in a low voice. Arabella's eyes sought her husband's face, but it seemed as if she did not see him. "William," she said, "William, keep close to me. It is coming, my beloved. It is coming. Do not leave me." "I am here, dear one, I am here," replied Seymour, gazing in agony upon her countenance. "My arms are round thee, Arabella. I will not leave thee. Would I could go with thee." "I am very cold, William," she said. "William, William." Her voice ceased, and with a slight shudder the fair pure spirit passed from its earthly prison and a tyrant's will to freedom and the presence of the King of Kings. "She is gone," said Sir Harry West. "She is gone. God receive your soul, sweet girl." But Seymour still held her in his arms, and bending down his eyes upon the inanimate form of her he loved, wept long and bitterly. When he raised them at length and gazed upon her face, he was surprised to see a smile upon her lips. He almost fancied that he had deceived himself, that she still lived, but it was fixed and immovable, only to be changed by the slow decay of the tomb. "How sweet she looks," said Sir Harry West in a whisper to the chaplain. "I have often heard that the look we bore in infancy comes back upon us after death." "With those who have lived a good life," replied the clergyman in the same tone, "and one has but to gaze upon that face to see that she has departed to peace and rest. Be comforted, sir," he said, advancing and taking William Seymour's hand. "Be comforted, and if ever there was one for whose release from a life of care and sorrow those she has left behind should rejoice rather than mourn, it was this sweet lady. Here on earth she had nothing to expect but misery. Where she is gone, she has nothing to meet with but joy and glory. Pure and blameless in her life, full of faith and truth, relying on the atonement of her Saviour to wipe out the only stain upon her, the stain of Adam's fault, we dare not doubt, that joy will be her portion for evermore." "It were worse than blasphemy," said Sir Harry West. "True, true," answered Seymour. "I know it is so. I know these tears are selfish, but tell me, can a man lose the brightest possession that God has given him and remain to linger on through years, destitute of that which made life valuable, and yet not mourn? Bless thee, my sweet wife," he continued, bending down and kissing her cold brow. "May I soon join thee, for did the Almighty's will give me back all that I have lost but thee, ay, and add state and station, wealth and high command, friends, honours, glory, all that earth could afford, I still have lost the jewel of my soul, which nothing but another world can restore. I dare not, sir," he added, turning to the chaplain, "in the presence of my departed saint, call down upon the heads of those that wronged her the vengeance which is their due, but I am sure that the retributive hand of heaven will not be idle, and that for such deeds as these, when almighty forbearance is exhausted, due payment will be given. Ay, I am sure of it. On him and on his race shall descend the awful curse that plagues the wicked from generation to generation. From father unto son it shall extend, and one shall lay the foundation of the other's downfall. Blood and destruction, sorrow and dishonour, defeat, disgrace, and desolation shall haunt them to remote posterity, and the life and sufferings of Arabella Stuart shall stand upon the page of history to justify, even in the eyes of men, the terrible vengeance of a righteous God." "Hush, I beseech you, hush!" exclaimed the chaplain. "Remember, such words repeated—" "I fear him not," replied William Seymour vehemently. "He has taken from me the life of my life, and he can but send me to join her somewhat sooner. Oh, that he would! The crime were his then, not mine. And were it not for the fatal promise I have sealed with honour to stay but 24 hours within these realms, I would beard him on his throne, and tell him of all his infamy. Nay, my kind friend," he added, speaking to Sir Harry West, who advanced and took his hand, "I will keep my word, but, had I not poured forth the indignation of my heart, I think that it would have broken. Now, leave me here for a short time. I would fain spend an hour in sad and solemn thought beside her I so dearly loved. I shall be calmer then, for I will try to pray, and seek submission to the will of God. If you will wait for me for that time, Sir Harry, I will take my last leave of all I loved on earth, and gladly quitting these hated shores, will seek in other lands for some tranquillity." No one opposed his request, but leaving him alone with the dead body of Arabella, Sir Harry West and Ida Mara remained in the anteroom till the clock struck 1. That sound seemed to rouse William Seymour, for a few minutes after he came forth, with a countenance sad and stern, but calmer than before. Advancing at once to Ida Mara, he took her hand and gazed in her face for a moment or two without being able to speak. At length, however, he said, "How can I ever thank you? God will reward your long devoted love for her whom he has smitten. Leave her not, Ida, leave her not, I beseech you, till she is committed to the earth, and then remember that I shall always believe whatsoever I can do to protect and make you happy is done for her. Sir Harry West, I know, will watch over your fate, but there is nothing which you can require, and he can ask on your behalf, that will not give me consolation to perform. Now, good friends, I am ready. My last adieu is said." End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Arabella Stuart by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. The funeral of Arabella was over, and her grave was made amongst the mighty of the land, in the Abbey of Westminster. 2 months had passed, and Ida Mara, in deep mourning, sat in the hall of Sir Harry West's house, occupied in the usual task of embroidery. The good knight had left her about half an hour before. Mr. Crompton, who, as the reader may remember, had aided in the escape from Highgate, and was a frequent visitor at the house, having desired to speak with him alone. Ida was still busily engaged upon her task, with her mind occupied with sad and serious thoughts, though the deep grief which she felt for the loss of her to whom she had been so sincerely attached had naturally subsided in some degree under the balmy power of time, when Sir Harry returned with a grave and somewhat agitated air. "Put down your needle, my dear Ida," said the old knight, "and listen to me. I have something to tell you of importance." "What is the matter, dear Sir Harry?" she exclaimed, gazing at him eagerly. "You are moved. Something has grieved you." "No, indeed, Ida," replied Sir Harry West. "It is not exactly grief, though, perhaps, I am going to lose you. But if it is for your happiness, my dear child, I shall be content." "To lose me?" cried Ida Mara, turning deadly pale. "Are you going to send me away from you?" "No, not to send you," replied Sir Harry, "but perhaps you may think fit to go when you hear what I have to say. You know Mr. Crompton. He is a gentleman of good family, of honour and high principles, kind and generous in heart, and though not very wealthy, has sufficient for happiness. often having seen you with the Lady Arabella, and deeply touched with those high qualities which you have displayed towards her, and indeed towards everyone, he asks your hand." "Oh, no, no, no!" cried Ida Mara with all her Italian eagerness. "Tell him, I beseech you, Sir Harry, I am unworthy of the honour he intends me. Explain to him that I spring from another class. Tell my origin. Tell him how you first found me, a poor Italian girl, homeless, friendless, destitute." "I have told him all," replied Sir Harry West. "I judged it right to do so, and he thinks as I do, Ida, that such virtues, graces, and goodness as you possess form a better inheritance than stored up gold, or even a noble name. The only question is, Ida, can you love him?" Ida paused, and Sir Harry felt her hand, which he had taken, tremble violently. "No," she said at length. "No, I cannot." "But why?" asked the old knight. "He is handsome in person, gentle and kind in demeanour." She shook her head sorrowfully. "I cannot love him," she answered. "You will think me wrong, I fear, Sir Harry, to wish rather to remain dependent on your bounty than change it for any other fate on earth." "I do not think you wrong, my dear child," replied Sir Harry. "All I have is yours, for to you I owe whatever remains to me of life. But you must give me a decided answer, for I must deal plainly with this gentleman." "My answer is plain, my benefactor," replied Ida. "I cannot love him. I cannot wed him." "Good faith, then, dear Ida," said the old knight with a smile. "If you will not wed anyone else, I shall be fain to marry you myself." "What is that you said?" exclaimed Ida, with the light coming into her eyes. "What is that you said?" "I was but jesting, Ida," answered the knight, and immediately the blood rushed up into her cheek, and spread rosy over her forehead. "I was but jesting," repeated Sir Harry West. But Ida was very much agitated, and thinking he had pained her, he added, "I am well aware, my dear child, that however great may be the comfort and happiness to me to have you with me during my latter years, however deeply and tenderly I may love you, I must not, and ought not, to desire that you should sacrifice all for me." "I would sacrifice all, everything for you," cried Ida Mara eagerly. "I never, never wish to quit you." "Hear me, Ida, hear me," said Sir Harry West. "Your sense of duty and gratitude I know is unbounded, but the time may come when you will find someone to love." "No," answered Ida, "no, I shall never love anyone but you. If you send me from you, I shall die." And sinking down into a chair with a pale cheek and a quivering lip, she covered her eyes with her hand. "What is the matter, dear Ida?" said the knight tenderly. "You seem ill. What is it that you feel?" I do not know, she answered. "Oh, leave me, Sir Harry, and tell this gentleman that I grieve I cannot return his affection." "He is gone, Ida," answered the knight, "but I have promised to write to him. If I merely say that you cannot return his affection, he will ask to be permitted to pursue his suit." "Oh, no, no," cried Ida, clasping her hands. "He must not. I cannot. Tell him. Tell him what?" asked Sir Harry, not a little agitated himself. "Shall I tell him that you love another?" he added, in a low and serious voice. The crimson again rushed into her face, and she paused for a moment, casting down her eyes. Then raising them suddenly, she exclaimed in Italian, with all the wild vehemence which, derived from her nation and the climate of her birth, had characterized her demeanour before she had passed through so many scenes of sad and wearing anxiety. "Yes, yes, tell him I love another." "Indeed!" cried Sir Harry West, with a cheek somewhat pale, for, strange to say, he could more readily have borne to hear her say that she was ready to give her hand with indifference than to listen to an acknowledgment that she loved. "Ida must tell me whom it is she loves, and I promise her that nothing on earth shall be wanting on my part to promote her happiness. Tell me, Ida, tell me," he continued, seeing that she stood silent. "Tell me, I adjure you. If you have any consideration, regard, affection for me, keep me not in suspense, but tell me who it is. Nay, Ida, I beseech, I entreat." Ida gazed at him for a moment with her trembling lips apart, then cast herself into his arms, and with streaming eyes hid her glowing face upon his shoulder. "Who?" said the knight. She answered in a whisper. It was only one word, but Sir Harry West's eyes brightened. "Indeed, indeed, my Ida," he cried, still holding her to his heart. "And you willingly sacrifice all the bright and sunny part of life to be an old man's darling?" "I would rather," answered the girl, looking up, "I would rather be an old man's darling than a young man's neglected wife. All I ask is to remain with you for ever, never to quit you, to see you always, hear you always, and to give up my life to him who first protected me, first was kind to me, whom I have ever loved and ever shall love better than anyone on earth. Call me what you will, your child, your servant, anything, but send me not from you." "No, no, Ida," answered Sir Harry West, with a smile lighting up his fine, though somewhat worn countenance. "You have chosen your part, you have made up your mind. If you stay at all, it is as my wife." "Oh, with what joy!" she cried. "But I forget. Am I fit to be your wife? What will your relations, your high friends, say at your marrying the poor Italian girl?" "Let them say what they will," replied Sir Harry. "There will be gibes and scoffs enough at the old man marrying a girl young enough to be his daughter, aye, his granddaughter. They will say he is in his dotage, Ida, and predict all sorts of evil results." "They will speak false," she cried vehemently, "and if they did but know all that I owe to you—" "And all I owe to you, Ida," rejoined the knight, "they might comprehend the feelings that actuate us both. I look to you, dear one, whatever be their prophecies, to give them the lie." "I will do it," replied Ida Mara, and she kept her word, leaving on record that, for once, the marriage of a man of more than 60 with a girl of 22 produced happiness to both. End of chapter 46. End of Arabella Stuart by George Payne Rainsford James.